Hello, everybody, and welcome to Staying Home, your revolutionary guide to the Green New Deal. I'm Josh Fox. As you know, on this program, we mostly talk about different aspects of the Green New Deal, and that has to do with the renewable energy components, the components that are focused on social and economic justice, racial justice, frontline communities, justice for those who are at the brunt and the brink of real problems because of climate change. And we also deal a lot, of course, with the aspects of climate change that we all know so very well, right? Hurricanes, floods, fires. And some of the reasons why it's so important that we combine the issues of a value-based transformation with a technologically based transformation. What I mean is we're transferring to renewable energy, but we're also talking about justice. We're also talking about equity. We're also talking about fairness. And we're talking about how do we address problems that people who are in the midst of having impacts from climate change, who didn't cause those problems to begin with. And in some cases, people who even did cause those problems, right? Like people who use an enormous amount of carbon. So one of the aspects of the climate crisis that we don't talk about a lot, which I think, and I've started to focus on this about 2 years ago, really needs to be focused on, is the issue of climate change and migration, climate refugees. Now, for my focus has been about refugees coming to the United States or coming from the global south to the global north, right? The global south, places where poor people who haven't used a lot of carbon, right, who didn't cause the crisis in the first place, now are besieged with fires and storms and droughts and things that make it impossible for them to continue to live in their homes, right? Folks in Guatemala, farmers who can no longer grow crops because of either severe drought or extreme weather that's decimated the entire place. And those people migrating up through Mexico to our southern border, climate refugees. Similarly, people from the war in Syria. Many people note that because there was a 5-year drought in Syria, that caused the destabilization of that entire political system, which led to the civil war there. But the people who are leaving there are not just war refugees, they're also, in a sense, climate refugees. And we're going to see this as glaciers dry up, as water patterns shift, as it gets hotter and more inhospitable in a lot of places. And it occurs to me that we very much need to start to build a morality around the idea of climate refugees and climate change and how those shifts are occurring. Now, most of that discussion, which is in my mind, is internationally based, right? We're talking about issues of immigration, issues of people coming to the United States, coming to places like Germany and Italy and the global north, from places that are being ravaged by climate change, which of course brings to mind the idea of climate reparations, right? In the global south, these people did not burn a lot of carbon. They did not pioneer the industrial revolution. They did not pour, carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere for centuries like England and France and Europe. Now China, India, and the United States are doing. But what about, so we have to talk about that on a separate issue, a separate episode. But what about within the United States borders? What about people who are suffering wildfires, hurricanes, floods, and all sorts of damage inside this country? So my guest today wrote this cover piece for the New York Times Magazine. It's an incredible article about climate migration within the United States. How will climate change remap where Americans live? In the Sunday New York Times, and also online, of course. It's brilliant to look at it online also because there's really amazing photographs. So how will climate change remap where Americans live? Internally, in our own borders. And this is obviously a picture of the California wildfires. Abram Lustgarten is the writer of this. And I've known Abram Lustgarten for more than a decade, because back in 2008 and 2009, there were two rather intrepid, plucky, skinny, young reporters investigating an issue that nobody had ever heard of in Pennsylvania called fracking. And that was myself with a camera and to make my film Gasland, and Abram, who was working with ProPublica at the time, and still is. This is a ProPublica article, even though it's in the New York Times. So we've been on this beat for a long time. So it's exciting to have Abram back to talk about the evolution of Americans' thinking in terms of extreme fossil fuel energy, but also in terms of what does this mean? Where will Americans live in a climate-changed future? This is an issue that's going to be true. It's going to need to be investigated and really talked about. Because right now, in the Trump administration, we have the most hostile possible policies towards immigrants. We're separating families at the border. We're torturing them. Horrific stories are coming out of the concentration camps in the south of this country, in places like Texas and Louisiana, where forced surgeries are happening on migrants. Children are being separated from their families, tortured, COVID running rampant. We're in a state of absolute tyranny and immorality when it comes to migrants from other countries. Hopefully, and maybe, some of this remapping from Americans will make us more sympathetic towards the plight of others who are having to flee climate chaos. But let's get right to it. Let's discuss the issues and let's discuss the piece with Abram Lustgarten from New York Times /ProPublica. Here he is. So, Abram, amazing to see you again. I did tip off in the intro that 12 years ago, there were two young, spirited, skinny guys investigating fracking that nobody had ever heard of here out in the woods of Northeast Pennsylvania, and it was you and me. And I have to also tell you, when I saw this, I flipped out because for the last 2 years, I'm actually engaged in working on a film on climate refugees, not internal to the United States border like this article, but of course, the bigger issues of migration between the global south and the global north. And that film was put on hold and paused by the coronavirus because I can't travel to do it. But I'm so thrilled to discuss this topic with you, and such an interesting wrinkle that you've brought up here about internal migration within the United States. And this is an article that's unusual for you because you're writing it in first person. Talk about what brought this piece, this amazing piece, to the fore here.
Yeah, thank you. It actually grew out of looking at the international scope of global migration related to climate change. So, there was a part one in this series looking at global migration, and I'd been spending the better part of the last year and a half down in Central America and Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras, looking at how migrants were or potential migrants were, dealing with the changes in their landscape and their environment and their food supply, and grappling with the decision to move. And through, all those dozens and dozens of conversations with migration experts, it became pretty clear that, the United States was going to more or less face a version of the same thing. So, maybe not as extreme, but certainly will be affected by climate. And like you said, I live now in California, just north of San Francisco. And so in the 2 years I'm reporting on this story, our wildfires have gotten significantly worse. It started in, 2016, 2017. I was working on the story already in 2018, and the fires were terrible. And then obviously, this year, they feel cataclysmic. So that's just continued in the background. And the idea that that I might be facing the same sort of decision I was interviewing people about came up a while ago between me and my editors. But by the time we were drafting a final story this year, it became a real question. So I found myself right in the middle of it.
Let's just put that to the side for a second, though. Let's talk about the international situation, because this is first, and then let's move on to the United States if we can. Let me first say, you're tuned in to Staying Home, your revolutionary guide to the Green New Deal. I'm Josh Fox. I'm with Abram Lustgarten, and we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Staying Home, your revolutionary guide to the Green New Deal. I'm Josh Fox. I'm with Abram Lustgarten, brilliant writer that I've known for many years on fracking, first, ProPublica, and now his piece in the New York Times about will climate change remap where Americans live. We're talking about climate migration. Let's talk about the specifics of what's happening in Central America. There have been climate refugees that are coming from the global south to the global north, and specifically you mentioned Guatemala. Tell us about the conditions and what's forcing people to move.
Yeah, you bet. I mean, obviously, we see a lot of pressure here in the United States, the migrant caravans coming out of Central America and Mexico towards the United States. There's a lot of reasons why those people are moving, and it ranges from, intolerable violence to just the economic opportunity in the United States. And I went down to spend some time and try to figure out, to what degree environmental factors played a role in the migrant caravans we were seeing, but also how do people in general respond to environmental change, because we know that environmental change is going to get a lot worse there in the future. And so it was just in rural villages, farming communities where they grow maize and beans, and not places that are really well connected in terms of a migration relationship with the United States. There are many parts of Guatemala where, every other home is built with US dollars and remittances are a big part of the economy. I went to places that were much more remote than that and disconnected, indigenous Mayan communities. So they weren't thinking of migration as the obvious solution to their problems, but they were literally starving. They were fourth, fifth, sixth generation farmers whose family history had no comprehension of how to deal with the depth of drought and heat, and also just, even if not complete annual drought, but the unpredictability of precipitation. So they would have no water for 6 months of a growing season and then get deluged by enormous storms that would bring landslides down on top of them. And they just they can't grow food. And so I realized there wasn't much of a sort of pros and cons list in their thinking about whether to migrate. They were just starving. So they were moving. And the big picture behind that is that, the science says that it's going to get hotter and drier and more difficult with climate change, that those parts of the world will suffer, disproportionately to the rest of the world. They'll suffer worse. And so if the people there are responding to environmental change now and moving, then, safe to say that flow of population movement is going to increase in the future.
At any time during the last month, I could say to you, well, there's a major hurricane that's just about to hit the coast or the Yucatan, or you know what I mean? There's an incredible prevalence of that swing back and forth, as you mentioned. You're describing a situation which is, first of all, if you have massive drought, you can't farm. If you have extreme floods, you also can't farm. So this sounds like a really horrible situation. So in my thinking about this, I feel that, looking at this situation internationally, from the standpoint of human rights, for me, knowing full well that unless we do incredible overhaul of all society, which we have a plan for, Green New Deal, we'll reach 2 degrees of global warming. Within the next several decades, the United Nations predicts 780 million to 1 billion climate refugees worldwide at that point. And looking at the way or international law deals with refugees, and I know this intimately because my parents were refugees, my father was anyway, that there is the Geneva Convention allows for certain things to say you can declare asylum if you're being oppressed from the standpoint of religion or race or gender or sexual preference. What about a status of climate refugees? What about the legality of saying, well, I need to declare asylum because of climate change? Any thoughts on that, or the values that we need to start to evoke when we think about this crisis that's approaching?
Yeah, well, I'm with you. I think it sounds like in that the people that I've met that are displaced by climate-related factors, to me, meet every definition of, sort of colloquial definition of what a refugee is. And I think it's important to think about these people that way. But it's come up as a surprising, point of contention in my reporting. So, I use that phrase, climate refugees, and I get fact checks from people affiliated with the United Nations that say, no, these aren't refugees. That's a legal definition that applies to, victims of conflict or political persecution. And, luckily, we are not bound to use only legal terms approved by the United Nations as journalists. So we can use them as adjectives. And, and I think that refugee status applies because in my experience, in my travels and interviewing, I'm not talking to people who were, like I said, making voluntary or particularly subjective decisions. I mean, they were forced into their situations by a life or death predicament. They have very few options, and it's really a heartbreaking move for them as well as for anybody else. It's not. This is not a decision to migrate out of convenience or in pursuit of luxury or something.
And does the politics does the politics of their particular situation also sometimes apply, right? We're talking about Honduras, one of the most hostile countries in the world to environmentalists. Certainly, probably also to people who are fleeing for environmental reasons. Do you have insights about that?
Yeah, I mean, only to say that the politics of climate and migration are all so fraught, and that climate change is an exacerbating factor for everything. And so if there's a political conflict, then it tends to exacerbate that too. I mean, it's not that I worked with people who were persecuted for their environmental activism, though I'm sure that's prevalent. But it all intermingles. I mean, I spent time with a woman in El Salvador in San Salvador who had moved there from the countryside because her family was killed, by gangs, and she wanted to move to the United States. And so I interviewed her as a climate migrant she would normally be classified by people who look at migration as a victim of violence. If she moves to the United States, she'd be sort of put in that bucket of, Salvadorans are victims of gang violence, and so they are moving to the United States. I talked to her as a climate migrant because her first choice would have been to go back to her rural hometown village on the Guatemalan border of El Salvador, but there's no water. They can't grow food there. Her remaining family farms for a living. They don't have work. Their crops haven't come to full yield in 5 or 6 years straight. And so she feels like her only option is not only to move to the United States, but she feels that she is a victim of violence from gang warfare now only because the climate pushed her to be in that situation in the first place. And that's the way in which these things all get intermingled.
Right. Yeah. And that's so much of the thinking behind an idea like the Green New Deal, which is an intersectional political framework that deals with justice, and also about the climate crisis. Is there a way to think about this, since so many of these people from the global South are not the perpetrators of climate change? They're not the people burning carbon. They're not the people driving SUVs. They're not the people who are, plugged into a massive electrical grid running on coal or frack gas. Is there a way to think about this as climate reparations, right? Dealing with the victims of the climate crisis who are inexorably a part of that of the damages, but not people who caused it.
Yeah, I mean, that comes up a lot in my conversations, and there's many researchers that would advocate for that, that point out Americans' disproportionate role in causing climate change and suggest our disproportionate responsibility in helping the people who are most affected by it. I think that's logical, and I think there's a really strong moral argument. Unfortunately, I doubt that that's a realistic pathway for us politically in our future.
Well, right. The word reparations isn't politically popular, but from a standpoint of morality, I think it's an interesting notion. What about this idea, though, of getting refugee status? How would that occur, and have you pursued the thought of that? Have you asked around, because you're getting pushback on that question?
Yeah, I haven't much yet. It's come up in some conversations. I mean, what's necessary is to change some of the legal frameworks around support for and even identification of climate migrants. And it starts with some difficult questions, even valid data questions like who's a migrant and who's a climate migrant, and how do you define that? So I think there's a lot of people thinking about that now. I've heard some arguments that, by people who are concerned for the welfare of climate migrants who still don't think that climate refugees is the right sort of bucket to put them in, because some of those refugees want to be seen as more sort of, self-empowered and less victims of the state, or less subject to sort of political whims. But I don't know. It seems I haven't gone deep into the political.
I'm just fascinated by the idea, because
Yeah.
the refugee status comes from 60 years ago, right? The Geneva Convention, right? All these things that were based on identity politics, or the wars based on identity, right? Nazism. Yeah. And so it seems to me that the future framework has to be different, and has to be about climate. But let's go and move on to, before we start to get into the specifics of where Americans are moving and how it might be remapped. What are some of the emotions that you're going through when you have when you have a planner in your article of urban planning telling you should sell your house right away and move? What are some of the things that you're going through in terms of the mentality of a person on the front line, right? Because we talk about frontline communities as I guess, victims of fossil fuel extraction. But this is a different front line. Talk about the emotions.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a lesson to me, particularly in, about the subtleties of this decision, that it's not so black and white, right? I mean, like, if I look at data and I look at the facts that I've learned and the science that I've gathered around, what should or, might not suggest that someone move, it's kind of clear, like, I shouldn't live where I live. Many Californians maybe might want to move, but I don't want to. I'm not ready to. I have a lot of reasons for living where I live, and most of them are subjective or emotional or, whatever. I love the landscape. I love the place. I have a community. So I realize in processing that, both how painful, this sort of climate displacement can be ultimately, even as, one of them on the spectrum of how privileged people in the world are, I have to be among the most. But also how gray that decision-making area is. And so, you think about like how slow people have been to adapt generally to the idea of climate disrupting their lives. Well, now I realize there's a lot of reasons for that. So.
Well, it reminds me of back in the day, like when the fracking industry, I should say, you're tuned in to Staying Home, your revolutionary guide to the Green New Deal. I'm Josh Fox. We'll be right back. You're tuned in to Staying Home, your revolutionary guide to the Green New Deal. I'm Josh Fox. My guest is Bram Lustgarten, talking about climate migration, his brilliant piece in the New York Times Magazine, New York Times, on how climate change will remap where Americans live. It reminds me a lot of when we were looking at people in the fracking world who were completely surrounded by fracking wells or fossil fuel infrastructure, and it was unsafe for them to live where they were living because of the very infrastructure that poisons them in their own homes and causes this type of problem. So now we're seeing that migration not only from the frontline poisoned communities, right, but also from the impacts of climate. You talk a bit about the decision to move. When are people's backs against the wall, when they're cornered, when they don't have a choice? And you talk about how migration can happen fast. I mean, with COVID, we saw a lot of people leave New York City and go up to the Hudson Valley, and second homes in the out of New York City, the prices were doubling overnight. Yeah. There's a shift that happens in the marketplace before it happens in terms of an actual avalanche or flood or fire. Talk a little bit about how that works.
Yeah, well, it starts with the idea that, Americans have been particularly illogical about where they live with respect to their environment for a long time. And they've done that because the marketplace has kind of pushed us in the wrong direction, right? Like you can live on the coast of Florida in the path of hurricanes because you can get cheap, subsidized insurance policies that the state of Florida mandates be available to you, even if the free market, so to speak, doesn't want to provide that. And the same in California now. I mean, the state is making it state law that you have to be able to buy fire insurance for your home if you live in a dangerous fire-prone area. And that encourages people to live in dangerous fire-prone areas, or at least makes it possible. So one of the changes that's happening in the market is that, we're going to see less and less of that kind of subsidization of, negative incentives. So insurers are less likely than they were in the past to insure dangerous areas. Government
and they're
programs
actually
that
dropping
subsidize,
policies, right?
They're dropping policies as fast as they can. Yeah, you're seeing things like the National Flood Insurance Program start to resist rebuilding homes in places that are repetitively flooded in the same place, which they've rebuilt homes 5, 6, 7 times in exactly the same spot. And now they're going to say, we'll give you your money, but you have to move out of that flood zone, which seems like an intelligent response. So that's all happening at the same time that, that
we need to talk about a relatively new show called the Republic, or UNFTR. As a Young Turks fan, you already know that the government, the media, and corporations are constantly peddling lies that serve the interests of the rich and powerful. But now there's a podcast dedicated to unraveling those lies, debunking the conventional wisdom. In each episode of the Republic, or UNFTR, the host delves into a different historical episode or topic that's generally misunderstood or purposely obfuscated by the so-called powers that be, featuring in-depth research, razor-sharp commentary, and just the right amount of vulgarity. The UNFTR podcast takes a sledgehammer to what you thought you knew about some of the nation's most sacred historical cows. But don't just take my word for it. The New York Times described UNFTR as consistently compelling and educational, aiming to challenge conventional wisdom and upend the historical narratives that were taught in school. For as the great philosopher Yoda once put it, you must unlearn what you have learned. And that's true whether you're in Jedi training or you're uprooting and exposing all the propaganda and disinformation you've been fed over the course of your lifetime. So search for UNFDR in your podcast app today and get ready to get informed, angered, and entertained all at the same time.
People are obviously coming to grips with the reality of their changing climate and changing the way they think about it. So all of that sort of comes together to provide a big economic push, maybe an economic tipping point. And when that happens, the people I talk to, as you read, suggest that tipping point can happen kind of quickly.
And that's not necessarily a point in a fire marching down the hill, but also in perception, right? Why are we still here? What are we doing? I was on this program with Robson Lutz from New Orleans, who's a very famous doctor who helped a lot of the post-Katrina recovery. And he said, well, look, New Orleans could become a Venice. I'm not leaving. I'm going to hitch my boat to Dumaine Street. And so there's people like that. At the same time, I remember being out in Colorado investigating the High Park fire with firefighters up there in the mountains who said the fire was coming at 35 miles per hour. Trees were literally, not to quote Donald Trump, but what they said was trees were literally exploding with fire in front of them. And they had to run to get away. These are the firefighters. And they were talking about how people were choosing to live up in the hills because they could. Because now all of a sudden zoning changes and people like to live up there. They like to live in the isolated mountains. And that's why so many of those homes burned and people died because they moved further up into the hills. That is still very much going on.
Yeah, I mean, the wildland urban interface is, what they call that. And it's a big deal in Colorado. It's a big deal in California. And, I'm as guilty as anyone. I love those environments. They're beautiful. I mean, that's partly why people move there. And so, the scientists I talk to say, that's a big part of the blame for what's happening in terms of wildfire destruction. Is it 30%, 50%, that and forest management? I mean, those are both real factors. But what happens is climate comes and piles on top of that and then just amplifies whatever risk already existed. But for sure, our behavior, our development patterns, our zoning, the way the economy pushes, people and home prices and values, those properties, that's all perpetuating, this kind of, irresponsible behavior.
Is there a scenario in which the tide of this is reversed? I mean, of course, I know the answer. But is that the perceptual shift that you know what I mean? Like, let's say we roll all sixes, Biden gets in, we have this $2 trillion climate plan. We're reimagining our cities to become completely different green places. We're cutting down carbon emissions. This process is still going to advance, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so to take a step back, big picture. I mean, as you know, like a certain amount of climate change is locked in. We've already done the damage, but an enormous amount of what's to come or how severe the future changes are still depends on what we do right now to slow emissions first and foremost. So action we take towards climate will make the long-term changes, that I'm describing, whether for the United States or for Guatemala, less. So right away, I mean, that we have an opportunity still to make this transition less painful. But at the same time, I mean, one of the lessons that I'm taking very personally from climate change is that it removes your ability to live your life exactly how you want it and to make all of those decisions. And it's a little bit, painful to have that sort of reality imposed, on you. And that's what's going to happen. So it's not that everybody will be forced to move or that every part of California or the Louisiana coast will become, completely uninhabitable disaster zones, but they will become, less attractive and less livable and require a little bit more, commitment to that if one chooses to continue to live in that environment. So, I think, best case for the future is that we, curb emissions and slow the rate of climate change, that the U.S. government continues to invest and help, foreign governments through foreign aid and things that can slow sort of some of that, equatorial region food insecurity growth that's going to drive international migration. And in the United States, that we come up with every policy we can, and it's really a mixture of, whether it's local planning or limiting expansion of houses into, forest land or forest interfaces, or planning for urban growth, so that when people do move, and they move to, to the city of Atlanta or whatever, that they can, that there's infrastructure for them, and there's affordable housing, and there's a fair, equitable market, and all that.
Let's talk about Atlanta for a second. You mentioned that in the article. You talk about how 1 out of every 10 households making less than $10,000, right? You're talking about a driver with climate change that exacerbates every other one of our social ills, right?
Yeah.
This is a social justice issue, and how people get dealt with in this way, whether they get a fair deal or a raw deal. I mean, I know communities that I've been in where the landscape was polluted and they put a subdivision on top of it, and they moved into the Black community, and lo and behold, 20 years later, they all get cancer, and then the settlement comes, but they don't give them enough money to move. This is the kind of thing that we have to talk about basic principles of justice. Talk a little bit about Atlanta as a tinderbox, you say, for social conflict. And what do you think is going to have to happen in many of those areas that are those quote unquote tinderboxes?
Yeah. So, I mean, the broad dynamic is that, as migration in the United States increases, like everywhere, it will likely lead to more urbanization. So people are going to move to cities. We also know climate is already to the cities. Yeah. Probably reversing the kind of trend that we see now, post-COVID. The demographers I talk to think that's sort of a temporary blip, but our long-term, over the last 50, 60 years, the United States has gravitated towards being increasingly urbanized, and probably will continue. Maybe they're wrong. But assuming they're right, or either way, the other thing that we know about climate is that it's already and will continue to exacerbate all of the inequalities that we're familiar with. So, the poorest parts of the United States, minority communities, Black communities, indigenous communities on the Gulf Coast are already the ones hardest hit. And when you see, new climate effects, whether it's in California or Houston or whatever, it's those same communities that have the least resources, the least valued property, the poorest health conditions, the least access to doctors, and all of those things that make them more vulnerable. And so those climate changes, just like COVID has affected minority communities, worse, those climate changes are going to affect minority communities worse. And so Atlanta is, an example of several things. It's one of, the most divided cities in the country in terms of the gap between extreme wealth and extreme poverty. There's few cities in the United States that have deeper poverty than Atlanta, and yet that city is booming. Atlanta is also a place that's tried to adapt. It's begun to adapt. And so it's become sort of a case study in this climate gentrification, which is this process that we're seeing, in a lot of places, California, Louisiana, and elsewhere, where from a policy perspective, they made some, laudable efforts to go in and do the right thing, or to green parts of the city, or increase infrastructure, make more green space, and so forth. But without a sort of dynamic planning that considers the broad effect of those changes on all sorts of communities, the effect has been to make those new places more attractive to the wealthy and pushes the poor out. And so it basically deepens the same kind of issues that we already have. And so what you see arising out of that conversation, or arising out of the Green New Deal, is an acknowledgement that this becomes a really dynamic problem that needs to be, attacked from multiple angles, and not just from a let's lower emissions and plant trees and save water perspective. That it's more complicated than that.
You're tuned in to Staying Home, your revolutionary guide to the Green New Deal. I'm Josh Fox. We'll be right back. You're tuned in to Staying Home, your revolutionary guide to the Green New Deal. I'm Josh Fox. My guest is Abraham Lusgard, and we're talking about climate migration. Let's talk about this term that you just brought up, which is a new one, I think, for a lot of us, although it's very, very clear and makes a lot of sense. Climate gentrification, right? The process of climate-safe areas being obtained and grabbed out of the hands of poorer and Black and brown communities by gentrifiers. Right, we've seen this in New Orleans, right? We see this river along the river, right? The Bywater, the Marigny, the French Quarter. These areas which didn't flood during Katrina, being ultra desirable, and in many cases now turning over completely, and their culture of those neighborhoods being decimated by gentrifiers coming from abroad, because those are the areas that are safer for climate. What does that mean in some of the contexts that you just brought it up, California and other places?
Yeah, so a lot of my reporting, this came up again, in Louisiana and Alabama, Mississippi, sort of the Gulf Coast regions, but not just in New Orleans, but in rural areas. When you see, there's sea level rise concerns on the coast. North Carolina is another example, and it's going to, it's beginning to push some of those coastal homeowners out away from the coast, but they don't want to move to Atlanta. They want to sort of stay connected to their community, maybe keep their job. Maybe they're willing to drive 35 minutes and, to their job. And so they move 40 miles inland, and they move into a little small town that was, had been there for 100 years, but had existed, at a fairly impoverished status quo. And they move in, they fix up their houses, they they change literally the color of that community, they change, the economic status of that community, and the people who were there can't afford to stay there, and so they move on. And that's a sort of climate gentrification, climate displacement. And you see it. You see similar things happening. In California, in the Bay Area, where I live. Sea level rise is a big concern, but the fire threat is another concern. And the mobility is a reflection of wealth to a certain degree, even in Guatemala. But it's all relative, right? So the people who recognize the situation and have the means to move and put themselves in a safer environment or a better investment environment, inevitably displace somebody who's already there, and also leave others behind who don't have those means. And that's the dynamic of gentrification.
So I've experienced this on a continental scale. When I was in Milwaukee, when I was on tour there, I was doing my solo performance, and after the show, the solo performance was all about climate change. All the activists came up to me after the show and said, "Well, you know what? Milwaukee is one of the best places to live in the future." And you mentioned that, I was sort of like, "Oh, geez," you mentioned in your article, Detroit, Rochester, Buffalo, Milwaukee, seeing a renaissance. What does that mean?
So it means two things. It certainly means it's a risk. Vancouver, already one of the most expensive cities in the world. But for cities that aren't, there's the risk of that gentrification if that's not addressed and planned for. And I think there's an opportunity to plan for it. But what it means, more generally, is that there are cities that have, and those are the examples of them, that have excess capacity, basically. Maybe it's because they passed their prime, like Detroit, or they were built for a larger population and they've seen out-migration in the past. And so they have capacity for in-migration now. They already have water infrastructure. They have, other cities are behind in terms of improving infrastructure, Atlanta or Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. Can never get enough money to build the things that they think they need for the growth that's coming or happening. Those other cities, the Rochesters and Buffaloes, they have that to spare, and there's room for people to move in.
So is there the equivalent of the Global South?
At TYT, we frequently talk about all the ways that big tech companies are taking control of our online lives, constantly monitoring us and storing and selling our data. But that doesn't mean we have to let them. It's possible to stay anonymous online and hide your data from the prying eyes of big tech. And one of the best ways is with ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN hides your IP address, making your activity more difficult to trace and sell to advertisers. ExpressVPN also encrypts 100% of your network data to protect you from eavesdroppers and cyber criminals. And it's also easy to install. A single mouse click protects all your devices. But listen, guys, this is important. ExpressVPN is rated #1 by CNET and Wired magazine. So take back control of your life online and secure your data with a top VPN solution available, ExpressVPN. And if you go to expressvpn.com/TYT, you can get 3 extra months for free with this exclusive link just for TYT fans. That's expressvpn.com/TYT. Check it out today.
In America, who are those people? Where are you seeing that? And what policies need to be put in place to address that issue?
Yeah, so we crunched a whole lot of data in my reporting, and we tried to overlap a couple risks so you could map them and just see what the United States looks like. And To summarize, it's like you got fire risk and drought and extreme heat that basically stretches, down the West Coast and into the Southwest and all across the southern part of the country and then up to the East Coast. And so those threats range from extreme heat to sea level rise, but it's basically a U-shaped around the bottom half of the United States. And by far, I mean, the worst hit parts of the country will be, the Gulf Coast and, in the deep Southeast and the deep South. They're going to face extreme heat, extreme humidity, sea level rise, to some degree, wildfire risk, crop failure, and so on. And so, the policies that address that range from policy support for things like forced retreat. I mean, the kind of programs you've heard about, on the coast of Louisiana that are taking communities and relocating them, out of the risk range of sea level rise, to infrastructure expansion in cities that are likely to absorb a whole lot of new people, so that there are, good systems in place for people to live good lives when they arrive at wherever they go, like Atlanta. To just curbing climate. Those are the three, when I talk to experts, and really the biggest is like preparedness and planning, and usually urban planning. But, policymakers have to begin to wrap their heads around the idea of population change and be ready for that in those destination places.
One of the books that I love kind of on this subject is A Paradise in Hell by Rebecca Solnit, which talks about how communities that are facing disaster, often, you see total chaos and craziness, but often inside of those communities, there's a response that is about us all being brothers and sisters in a community and helping each other out and building things that are free resources, right? And that's a kind of paradise that she posits, right? This idea that in the wake of the great San Francisco fire, there was a cafe that was open with all this free food, and people came in and out and they socialized, and it was all in a tent somewhere in the Presidio or whatever it was. Have you experienced communities that are dealing with it in that way? That you walk into places and it's not doom and gloom and division and strife and violence and anger and hatred and xenophobia, but actually, okay, let's roll up our sleeves and get this done. Have you experienced any of that?
Yeah, I don't think I have deep experience in that personally, but it's come up, through some of my reporting. I think that dynamic, which is very human and very understandable, probably matches disasters more than this sort of slow onset change, right? Like, hardship makes us stronger, and it draws your community together, and you find your brotherly love and willingness to help, your neighbors and your friends. The slow onset change, I think, can have a similar effect. And I'm thinking of Vermont. Vermont is an example of a place that's planning for climate-driven growth and is trying to build a sense of community around that. It's encouraging people to move. It's planning for a long-term population increase, and building a sustainable environment and sustainable systems and incentives for solar and renewable energy and all of those things. So, taking a proactive stance towards the needs of the people that are going to be coming there, is one kind of approach to that. But unfortunately, I mean, I think I more often see, and I experience here, that kind of every man for himself kind of dynamic. And I hate to be dark about it, but what that is, I mean, that's a reflection of a lack of policy and support, because sometimes, a disaster, a Katrina, or an earthquake in San Francisco is a finite thing. It begins and ends, and you can see the damage that it did, and you can respond to that, and you can respond to it by, locking arms with the community around you. But a bigger, slower onset kind of change without policy to support that, to define it, and to slow it down, or to present alternatives, it leaves people with sort of no choice but we're not in a life or death situation here the way farmers in Guatemala are. But we
not
still
yet, but it could happen in the blink of an eye.
Not yet.
Okay. So
not yet, but yeah.
In the last minute we have, I asked this of a lot of people who are on the show from frontline communities. And since that definition now extends to you, in this regard, what does justice look like? Green New Deal is so dedicated to the idea of justice. What does justice look like for communities that have to migrate?
So I'd go back to what I learned about Atlanta. I mean, what activists in Atlanta told me is that the planning for disadvantaged communities has to happen at the same time that there's planning to build response and adaptation to climate change. And that if they don't happen at the same time, then it amplifies inequity. So this idea of the resilience being a term that's about defending the status quo, but we don't want the status quo because it's too divided. And what we need is kind of a new status quo that's more balanced and more equitable. And so we want to look to respond to climate change in a way that spreads its benefits and, its increased resiliency across communities that don't benefit from it now.
Like taking the problem and making that the solution, right? In many ways, like looking at the Green New Deal as a climate plan, but also it's a jobs plan. And the idea of migration now as a justice plan. I love this. Abram, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Your reporting is so brilliant, and I know that we're going to have further conversations on this because we're both working in the same area. Once again, thanks.
It's great to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's our show for today. You've been tuned in to Staying Home, your revolutionary guide to the Green New Deal. I'm Josh Fox. We'll see you tomorrow. So, man, when I saw this, I was like, holy crap, man, we're a parallel exist, but not so surprising.
Thanks for listening to the full episode of the Young Turks. Support our work, listen ad-free, access members-only bonus content, and more by subscribing to Apple Podcasts at apple.co/TYT. I'm your host, Cenk Uygur, and I'll see you soon.